Hi everybody, welcome to the Kids Podcast, What Kids Need. In today's podcast I want to talk about boundaries. Boundaries are really interesting when you're a parent because they can be really hard to, one, know where they are, and two, enforce boundaries. A boundary is just a place that we don't go past, that's all it is. And children actually need boundaries because children are not very good at making boundaries. They just want to do everything in every way they want to do it. Therefore, your role as a parent is to make boundaries. The boundaries are there to keep children safe. And I think if you keep that in your mind, that's why you're setting up the boundary, that the boundary's there to stop them getting hurt or hurting somebody else. And if you always keep that in mind, you'll realise that you don't need a lot of boundaries. If you have too many boundaries and there's too many rules that go with the boundaries, you're going to spend your whole time telling them off. Therefore, try to figure out, is this boundary going to keep them safe and that so they don't get hurt? Or is it going to keep someone else safe and that they don't hurt somebody else? And really, they're the only boundaries you actually need, in my opinion. All the others are peripheral rubbish. That isn't important. Whether they rock the chair at the table is only important if the chair's going to break. Whether the way they eat. They will eventually learn all these things by modelling. You don't have to be on their back every minute of the day about everything. Some of the boundaries are social boundaries too. What is acceptable socially and not sociably. For example, if you're out and your child's rude to somebody and you can see that they've hurt their feeling, like they say, oh, you're a really big fat person, you're too fat, then they've crossed actually a social boundary. So there's boundaries within the house that you'll have. There's the two, hurt someone and being hurt, but there's also social boundaries that you need to teach your children. And these are things that keep your children safe, but also keep your children from being disliked by other people. Because that's what you've got to understand. If you don't have boundaries with children and teach them, then other people make assessments and judgments of them and treat them accordingly. And they often end up being the scapegoats at school, or the kid who's always framed, or always they go straight to that child thinking that that child did it, and you don't want your child to be that child. When I made boundaries with my kids, I made sure that they were following in those areas I've just spoken about. If I thought that they were, one, going to be hurt, trying to climb the fence, which was galvanised iron, which didn't have a cap on the top so they could get cut, that became then a boundary. Or climbing onto the roof if I didn't feel that that was safe that they were on the roof. I had boys, so I was watching them all the time. Also in the kitchen, boundaries about lighting the stove, if you have a gas stove, putting a knife in the toaster. These are all the boundaries that you need to teach them to keep them from hurting themselves. And that's really, really important, that you keep your children safe from hurting themselves. And even though you have these boundaries, the children will cross them sometimes. So don't be alarmed if you make all these boundaries and then you find, they've done something that you've just told them not to do. Tell them, no, you don't do that. We've spoken about this before. You don't have to punish them. You just have to reinforce the boundary. The other ones is boundaries to keep others safe, and that's to stop them from hitting or hurting other people or children or even pets, and then also to be keeping them from hurting other people by what they say, because they will come out and say some quite nasty things, and you need to make a boundary there. So it's important that your children realise that what comes out their mouth is not acceptable sometimes, and there's a boundary of what you can and cannot say, and then that crosses into all the social boundaries. That when you go out, there's certain things that you do. You dress appropriately, you don't throw things around in the shop, you be polite to people, you be thankful when people do things for you. That's a social convention. People give you a present, you say thank you. These are boundaries that your children need to learn. Of course, at school they will learn a different set of boundaries to when they're at home, and that's separate to almost what you do, but they are aligned. They will be aligned to what you're trying to do at home. It's very important too to understand that if you don't have very strong boundaries yourself, around yourself and for yourself, you're going to find that your boundaries aren't very good. For example, you'll make boundaries with your children, but then you will change them all the time. So you need to get a little bit firm with yourself, work out what the boundaries are. You might even have to write it down. It's not a bad idea, honestly, to write down what are the 3 lots of boundaries: hurting themselves, hurting other people, being socially acceptable behaviour, and write those 3 boundaries and what things would go in there. For example, what would those boundaries actually look like in your physical life? Then you need to stick to the boundaries. Now, there are times when you can be flexible with children and you can change the rules, and that's a good way to be. It's better than being black and white. However, you can't have made a boundary and then constantly be shifting it all the time. It's too confusing for children. So if you've said they're not to hit other children, you can't then let them hit other children, or they tell them it's okay to hit someone at school if they hurt you. You have to make sure where your boundary is to tell the child where the boundary is. So get kind of clear with yourself. I think it can be quite a good lesson for ourselves to learn where our boundaries are too with children, because that's the other thing that comes up with boundaries. Like, we'll have certain boundaries with our own children where they can't cross, and we need to know where and what those boundaries are. Otherwise, how can we kind of enforce them or expect them? So if you don't want your children to swear at you, or you don't want your children to physically attack you in any way, that then becomes a boundary. And then of course you've got to enforce that boundary by telling them that they're not allowed to do it, and then explaining to them why they don't do it. Now, with boundaries, it's very important to explain to a child why you don't do it. Remember, they don't know everything. You're teaching them. So you need to take the time to teach them. We don't hit other people because we can hurt them. And it's not acceptable in our society anyhow to run around hitting people. You don't see people hitting each other when you go out to, shops or somewhere. So when they do that, they get into trouble. So you need to teach them these rules. That's what you're teaching. You're teaching them why we have a boundary and what the boundaries are. I don't feel you have to punish children, particularly when you're teaching boundaries. I'm not a great one for punishment. I'm a great one for boundaries and discipline, but not so much punishment. I think children can learn by you just speaking to them and explaining it. They just need to have it continually reinforced. That's what it is. And they have to know why you want to reinforce it. What are the outcomes? Why I'm not supposed to do certain things. What are the outcomes of if I did do that, and how I could injure myself or somebody else. That's what you're needing to teach them, that there's a reason you have the boundary, and that's why we're doing it. It's not seen as a punishment. You're not allowed to do this because I'm punishing you. I'm doing this to keep you safe and others safe, and that in society you know how to behave. It is a great thing to teach children, one, where the boundary is, but two, why the boundary is there. Children understand things. They're not stupid. They will understand why you don't want them to run across the road without stopping and waiting and holding your hand. And you need to understand these things, firstly, to teach them and explain it to them. I always used to explain to my kids why. When you first write down your list or start working out your list, also put them in a priority. Some will be very high boundaries, like the safety ones, like not using the gas stove when they're young, or playing around with any things that are dangerous around the house that are electrical. They will be strong boundaries. Others will be less strong, and you might not be as firm with them, and they can have some flexibility. Like, there might be some boundaries in terms of what they're allowed to do and not allowed to do around the house that become less important, and especially as they get older, because remember, what a 3-year-old can do is different to what a 10-year-old can do in terms of safety. And so you need to be changing the boundaries all the time. For example, if the one kid's allowed to go on the shed roof with dad and he's 9, and the 5-year-old wants to get on the shed roof, the rule is no, but you have to be older to get on the shed roof because it's a safety issue. But then, of course, when that child is that age, the smaller one, who's now 9, they too can get on the shed roof with parental supervision if that's what the parents think is okay. So the boundaries change as they get older. You need to understand that as well and keep changing them. They're also something that is negotiable between you and them. So a boundary doesn't have to be set. It can be negotiated between you and the child. And actually, that's a really good thing to teach your child, because you can teach them what compromise is, that you make a compromise with them. So, for example, they normally on a weeknight go to bed at 7:30 or something, but it's somebody's birthday, grandpa's birthday, so tonight you go to bed later, and you don't push the boundary. You don't make them go to bed when grandpa's there, and you negotiate. This is how you also build trust with your children, that you listen to them and that you take their view into consideration. So set up your boundaries for the 3 reasons I said, but make sure you don't have too many unnecessary ones. If you stick to the don't hurt other people, don't get hurt, and socially acceptable behaviours, you will actually find that it gets rid of lots and lots of other rules and regulations. And the more rules and regulations you have with your children, the more trouble you're going to have, because you've got to keep at them to do it. Just have less of them. Most of the stuff's not important. It really isn't. And it's just about making your life harmonious with your child and growing them up to be a responsible young person. So I'm hoping that'll make you think about boundaries differently. They're not just places that we have to do because everyone else does them. And don't worry what your parents think or other friends. You do the boundaries that work for you. For example, we never had a curfew with our boys. We never said you have to be home by 11:30. We never had that, because I had 3 strong-willed boys, which is, I think, a good thing to be strong-willed. And so we just said, you just ring us when you're ready to come home, and we'll go and pick you up, because we used to go and pick them up, particularly before they were driving. And that worked brilliantly. They never got into trouble for being too late. Because in a weeknight school they weren't going out so much to parties, but on the weekend we just found they just rang us up and we just hop in the car and go and pick them up. But we actually never had boundaries when they were in high school, and we never had trouble with having to make a big issue about it or them being late. It was a trust thing on both sides, and in our case our boys just wanted to come home when they got sick of it or tired, and we came and picked them up, and it was easy. However, other families, we knew everyone had boundaries. You had to be home by 12, and I'm picking you up at 11:30 and all these things, but we didn't make those. So you can make your own individual boundaries and find what works for your actual family. And that's also the best thing to do, because remember, in each family there's different individuals, so you're dealing with different personalities as well. Good luck with the boundaries. Make sure you know where yours are as well, and then where theirs are. And I'm wishing you a good week with your kids, and I hope you enjoy them. Sending you lots of love and light.